of the biggest misconceptions about addiction is that when the drinking or using stops, the healing starts. Sometimes it does, but more oftentimes than not, it doesn't. I've sat with a lot of families who waited months or even years for sobriety to change the relationship, only to find out that even though their loved one got sober, nothing really changed and things felt exactly the same as when their loved one was in active addiction. That's the conversation I want to have today, because sobriety is incredibly important. It's just not the same thing as recovery. Before we get started, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're also untangling the patterns you had to develop just to survive. So the drinking stopped, the drugs stopped, but they're still lying. They're still getting defensive. They're still blaming everyone else. They still can't tolerate criticism, and they still avoid difficult conversations. The relationship still feels exhausting. So what happened? The first thing to understand is that sobriety and recovery are not the same thing. Sobriety means someone has stopped using alcohol or drugs. Recovery is the process of learning how to live without needing those substances in the first place. Those are two very different things. Sobriety means they're no longer using the substance, and recovery means they're learning an entirely new way of living and being. I think we've unintentionally done families a disservice by making sobriety the finish line. It's not. It's just the beginning. Alcohol and drugs don't just create problems, they actually solve problems too. Now, I know that sounds incredibly counterintuitive, but hear me out here. They serve a purpose. Otherwise, your loved one would have abandoned them long before the addiction took hold. They numb the effects of anxiety, shame, and grief, and they can very effectively distract someone from loneliness and boredom. They help people avoid conflict, even though it seems like they actually create more conflict. They also provide temporary relief from emotional pain, and when someone gets sober, all of those emotions are still there. That's why early sobriety can feel harder than active addiction. The substance is gone now, but the pain isn't, and now it might even be amplified. For years, that substance may have been the person's primary coping strategy, and every time they felt anxious, ashamed, rejected, lonely, or overwhelmed, they reached for something that made those feelings disappear. When you remove the substance, you remove the coping strategy. You haven't automatically replaced it with a healthier one, and that's actually where recovery begins. Recovery is learning how to tolerate discomfort without escaping it. They have to learn how to first identify their emotions, because after years of active use, sometimes people don't even know what they're feeling, and those sensations can feel pretty terrifying. Then they have to learn how to manage and regulate those emotions while also learning how to not be defensive or controlling or withdrawing entirely. One thing I want to add here is that this does not apply to abuse. Abuse is not as a result of mismanaged emotions. It's not because someone has anger issues that they're abusive, and that includes coercive control, which is actually the underpinning of abuse. It's a beast all of its own, and substances have been found to amplify that behavior, but not cause it. So we're not excusing controlling and abusive behavior towards others here, but instead identifying the need for a sense of control established because of trauma or the addiction itself. Okay, so back to it. Those aren't sobriety skills, they're recovery skills. Let's lean into the science a little bit here. When addiction becomes someone's primary way of coping, emotional development often slows. It doesn't stop completely, but many of the opportunities to learn healthy emotional regulation get interrupted. We sometimes refer to it as arrested development. Now imagine someone started drinking heavily at 20 and got sober at 40. They have 20 years of experience avoiding uncomfortable emotions. They don't necessarily have 20 years of experience working through those emotions sober. Recovery is where that learning finally starts. You may have heard the phrase dry drunk. It's common in recovery communities, but it's important to know that it's not an official diagnosis. You won't find it in the DSM, and there isn't a standardized clinical definition in the research. But what it describes is something many families have experienced. The alcohol and drugs are gone, but the relationship still feels unhealthy. If they're still reactive, dishonest, blaming, emotionally unavailable, and still expecting everyone else to change before they do, then I describe it a little differently. I'd say the person has probably achieved abstinence, but they haven't yet developed the emotional and relational skills that support long-term recovery. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA, outlined 4 major dimensions of recovery. They are health, so overcoming or managing one's diseases or symptoms, for example, abstaining from use of alcohol, illicit drugs, and non-prescribed medications if one has an addiction problem, and for everyone in recovery, making informed, healthy choices that support physical and emotional well-being. Having a stable and safe place to live. Purpose, conducting meaningful daily activities such as a job, school, volunteerism, family caretaking, or creative endeavors, and the independence, income, and resources to participate in society. And community, having relationships and social networks that provide support, friendship, love, and hope. You'll hear in recovery communities the opposite of addiction is connection. It is vital and important that people in recovery maintain connection with others, because isolation and boredom are 2 of the biggest triggers for relapse. Something I want to be clear about here is that it's not every unhealthy behavior is because of addiction, and not every unhealthy behavior disappears when someone gets sober. Addiction and unhealthy relationship patterns often overlap, but they aren't the same thing. Someone may lie because they're protecting an addiction, but they also may lie because that's how they've learned to cope with shame. Just because someone avoided intimacy and used substances to numb their emotions, they might also avoid intimacy because vulnerability has never felt safe. And just because someone became controlling because they were trying to protect their access to alcohol or drugs, they might also use control because they genuinely believe control is how relationships work. Sobriety addresses the substance. Recovery addresses the person. Sometimes that's enough, and sometimes it isn't, because addiction often exists alongside trauma, attachment injuries, depression, anxiety, learned family patterns, or even abusive belief systems. The substance didn't necessarily create those problems. Sometimes it just amplified them. Sometimes it covered them up. And when the substance is removed, those issues often become easier to see, and families are often disappointed because they expected sobriety to repair the relationship, but instead, sobriety exposed the work that still needed to be done. So why does this happen? Well, long-term substance use changes brain circuits involved in reward, stress, impulse control, judgment, and emotional regulation. The encouraging news is that the brain can change too. Through neuroplasticity, new neural pathways develop as people repeatedly practice healthier ways of responding to stress, emotions, and relationships. That doesn't necessarily happen when someone wraps up treatment. It happens when they keep practicing recovery. Recovery is a practice, it's ongoing. Research has also been done on something called recovery capital. SAMHSA mentions this on their website, so I wanted to share more research I found on it because I think it's vital to sustained recovery. Recovery capital is everything someone builds that supports long-term recovery. It's healthy relationships, it's a sense of purpose and meaning, community. That sense of belonging and accountability is so important. Physical health, emotional regulation, problem-solving skills, stable housing, employment, and hope. The more recovery capital someone develops, the more likely they are to sustain recovery over time. Notice what isn't on that list. Simply not drinking. Recovery isn't measured by what someone stopped doing. It's measured by what they're building. So when families ask me what they should actually look for, I don't start with sober time. I watch for different things like, can they tolerate difficult emotions without escaping them, or hear feedback without becoming defensive? Can they admit when they're wrong and repair the harm that they've caused? Can they stay present during conflict instead of shutting down or trying to control the conversation? Those are recovery skills. Those behaviors rebuild trust. Trust isn't built when someone stops drinking or using. It's rebuilt through consistent behavior repeated over months and years. And families, you have recovery work too. After living with addiction, your nervous system learns to expect chaos. Your recovery is learning that you don't have to stay in survival mode forever. It's learning boundaries and rebuilding your own life. It's recognizing that you can support someone else's recovery without becoming responsible for it. Now, if there's one thing I'd want families to remember, it's this. Don't confuse abstinence with transformation. Celebrate sobriety. Yes, it's an incredible accomplishment. But keep watching. Watch for humility. Watch for accountability. Watch for emotional growth, and watch for someone who's becoming more capable of loving, repairing, and taking responsibility. Because sobriety removes the substance, Recovery changes the mechanisms behind the addiction. Well, that's all for now. As always, thank you for being here. I've included links to the studies I mentioned in the description. If you'd like to research yourself, you might find something I missed. If so, leave a comment. And if this episode resonated, share it with someone who you think could also benefit. Until next time.